Yo guys, I made a new sexuality now, actually. It's called super straight, okay? Since straight people, or straight men as myself, I get called transphobic because I wouldn't date a trans woman. You know, they're like, would you date a trans woman? I'm like, no, why? That's a female. No, like, that's not a real woman to me. Like, I want real woman. No, you're just transphobic. So now, I'm super straight. I only date the opposite gender, women, that are born women. So you can't say I'm transphobic now because that's just my sexuality, you know?
On February the 21st, TikTok user Kyle Royce posted a video in which he claimed that his critics could no longer call him transphobic for refusing to date trans women, who he explicitly refers to transphobically, because he had just made up a new sexuality, super straight, defined as heterosexuality with transphobic characteristics. Fuck, how many times am I going to say transphobic this episode? A lot. So yeah, super straight means you're straight, but you're only attracted to or date people who are assigned the opposite gender to you at birth, which quite obviously closes the door on anyone with an intersex condition, for example, if we're going off all of one of the many problems that there are with this particular orientation. He tags the video hashtag funny, hashtag viral, hashtag new trend, hashtag trending, hashtag blow this up, cause as it's pretty obvious, the kid doesn't care about what he's actually saying or, starting any kind of movement. He cares about getting clicks and views, and the internet loves edgy, bumfluff, sporting teens talking nonsense. The real problem with this movement, and again I use that term very loosely, is that the video got around 2 million views before it was taken down by TikTok, and 4chan users on poll, truly the maturity high point on the internet, have been pushing it for two reasons. One, it drives a rhetorical wedge in the LGBT movement, only really online. No one in the real world legitimately cares about the super straight movement. Ellipses. Yet. And two, because they're a bunch of far-right wank stains who can use this as just another way to push explicit Nazi rhetoric and symbolism into the mainstream. This meme right here will never not be relevant. I just wish they didn't have to do my precious boys, Gimli and Legolas, like this. You can't go into a viral TikTok comment section anymore without someone pushing the imitation Pornhub logo that is the super straight flag. Fake coming out videos littered the super straight hashtag before it was banned. And, plus side. And it's all a bit much, you could say, but it makes sense when you put it in the context of a reactionary psyop pushed by bad faith actors on the right, trying to cause harm to trans voices. Yes, that's the context with which we are putting it in today. The issue with the vast majority of reporting on the issue is that it is lacking in that overall context. Super straight is just the newest in a long line of openly harmful reactionary movements online, which in turn were just real-life right-wing reactionary movements transitioning their rhetoric into the online space. And I love you, birds, but now is not the time. Media outlets just posting this as an isolated incidence of transphobia are missing the point. They're not wrong on the transphobia. It isn't necessarily transphobic to not date a trans person. Essayist Bryn Tannehill, lefties, stay with me on this one, wrote for The Advocate, the belief that all transgender people are unattractive to you, where there are some undeniably very attractive ones, and that you could not have chemistry with them, or you religiously object to transgender people, even when presented evidence to the contrary, is an expression of transphobia. If your preference is brown hair, blue eyes, and long toes, sure. If your preference is I don't like trans people, then yeah, you can get the fuck out. The problem in reporting arises when outlets refuse to talk about what other events led to this kind of movement, and how inextricably linked the super straight, gender-critical, TERF and far-right movements really are. And its refusal to do that means that we have to keep litigating this over and over and over and over. But first, I need to put a pin in that, because it's time to talk about reaction as a political force. The The ousting of Maximilien Robespierre on 9 Thermidor 2, or the 24th of July, 1794, in a coup that brought about the execution of Robespierre and 104 of his Jacobin compatriots, and the end of the Committee of Public Safety, generally speaking. Whilst the popular forces of the left were still nominally in charge of France, the event has come to be known as the Thermidorian Reaction, a movement within the revolution against the tyrannical Jacobin leaders, and sought to bring the monarchist factions of the country back to the negotiating table. The French Revolution is known in popular culture for a couple of things. The mass execution by guillotine, probably being the most recognizable image that comes from this period. What is less commonly attributed to the revolution in popular culture, not in academia, is the introduction of the modern ideas of both the left and the right. The left, led first by the Girondins and then by the Jacobins and Montagnards, called for the perfect republic under the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the end of slavery and the end of the clergy, and also, of course, universal suffrage, you know, that little important topic. The right, led first by the monarch himself and then by the royalists and the clergy, wanted a return to that absolute monarchy. You know, power centralized within the birthright head of state at Versailles, with absolute control over the army, clergy, laws, and justice systems. Obviously, a spectrum of beliefs exist between these two extremes, but throughout the revolution, until the Napoleonic coup of 1799, the dominant force in the country was the left. During the revolution, however, the forces of reaction were always afoot. In fact, the word reactionary was first used in English in a translation from an account of the coup of 1852, a left-led coup against royalist forces within the French Directory near the end of the revolution. The move to centralize power within the seat of consul under Napoleon is a move from a reactionary state of mind, even though he was still nominally not a monarch until 1805, when he crowned himself King of France, a move that is nothing but conservative fan fiction. Though after the first defeat of Napoleon, the colonial powers of Europe restored the Bourbon dynasty to power, and then after the second defeat of Napoleon, restored the Bourbon dynasty to power again. The absolute centralization of power behind the monarch was a pipe dream at that point, as the fervor of republicanism, or the fact that it was at least still kind of there in the population, was so strong that the king had to acquiesce to the demands of the people and elect a council of deputies to be his legislative body, a first parliament of which that was dominated by hardcore conservatives, happy to see a strong, powerful monarch once again ruling over the people. Chambre Introuvable, as Louis XVI would call them, set about repealing every single law that they could, trying to revert conditions to as close to the absolute monarchy of Louis XV. Prior to the revolution. These ultra-royalists could be seen as the first reactionary movement, truly of the right, to hold mass power in Europe, and they paved the way for the movements that would follow. Key ideologues in conservatism at the time included philosopher Edmund Burke, who was a staunch oppositionist to the French Revolution, and who wrote this about natural hierarchies present in the Renaissance period. We fear God, we look up with awe to kings, with affection to parliaments, with duty to magistrates, with reverence to priests, and with respect to nobility. Why? Because when such ideas are brought before our minds, it is natural to be so affected. Thoroughly unsurprising that now we consider this incredibly reactionary mind to be the father of modern conservatism. Another one was the foreign minister of the Austrian Empire at the time, the Prince Metternich, who fought any advance of social liberalism in Europe, specifically, and weirdly enough at the time, coming from the Russian Empire. If you want to know more about that, I would suggest listening to the Revolutions podcast. But it wasn't until the advent of a Marxist ideology and framework and the 20th century that we see the word reactionary be used regularly and as a pejorative. In Marxist academics, a reactionary denotes an individual or group whose ideas appear socialist, but contain elements of capitalism, fascism, nationalism, and other bourgeois ideological elements. And whilst this term isn't normally what you see when you see someone get called reactionary, it's certainly an interesting framework with which to view the term. Modern reactionary groups don't really want to return to the lineage of European monarchy anymore. Most. There are definitely a few, but are more likely to push for an agrarian, authoritarian regime. The motto in Vichy France was Travail, Famille, Patrie, while Benito Mussolini said, and I quote, "Fascism is reaction," and fascism, which did not fear to call itself reactionary, has not today any impediment against declaring itself illiberal and anti-liberal. The push for Lebensraum in Nazi Germany was all about gaining more workable agrarian space for the German peoples, pushing further out their authoritarian ideology. Professor of political science at Brooklyn College, Corey Robin, openly states in his book, The Reactionary Mind, From Edmund Burke to Donald Trump, that he believes modern conservatism is fundamentally a reactionary ideology, which brings us full circle. And I agree with Corey. So how is this related to this? In more ways than you probably expect. Reaction doesn't have to be a part of an overall societal movement or a segment of a well thought out political ideology. It can just be the ideology itself. This is my theory. I mean, I'm sure there are probably some much more intelligent and smarter people than I writing this stuff in journals right now, or something like that. But this is what I've come to believe in my years living on the internet. Reaction as ideology is the principle by which you don't have to have any outward political beliefs other than the opposite of whomever you are arguing with. Playing devil's advocate as political thought, but worse. Dan Olsen's incredible video about Gamergate puts this very plainly for me in his discussion of 4chan. I wonder how that connects to here.
Gamergate spawned from the 4chan boards V and Poll, and of particular relevance to us is the gender constructs held by those spaces expressed with the mimetic idea of there are no girls on the internet, tits or GTFO. Tits or GTFO is an enforcement mechanism protecting the status quo. The idea, as explained in a particularly popular post, is that due to the anonymous nature of most interactions over the internet, no one will know if you're a woman unless you specifically mention it. Moreover, even if you claim you're a woman, you have to prove it, hence, tits or GTFO. While 4chan interprets this as everyone is anonymous, a more accurate reading is everyone is default until proven otherwise. By retaining anonymity, you enjoy the protections inherent to membership in the majority. This is obviously of some appeal to individuals who are otherwise marginalized. The only cost is the annihilation of one's own identity, or at least a willingness to subsume those aspects that are out of harmony with the Gamergate normal.
When the normal, the status quo, protects you, where you are the status quo, and you have the power of anonymity on your side, there is nothing stopping you from being openly reactionary to those who would take the status quo away from you. It is in your best interest to do so. To be a part of a reactionary movement used to involve having to go and meet people in person, going to rallies, reading literature on it. I don't know, can Nazis read? But now, to be part of a reactionary movement, all you have to do is retweet a hashtag or send someone a meme DM. Again, Dan Olsen says it best in the Gamergate video.
I'm going to restate that just because of how important it has been in the course of the last few months. The use of terror tactics, even if only by a minority, has created an environment of fear that all members enjoy the privilege of. When people are unwilling to engage because they are afraid that they'll be next, that their websites will be attacked, that their information will be stolen, that their employers will be harassed, that they'll have child pornography tweeted at them or sent to their email, all members benefit from that person's silence, even if they were not personally responsible for the harassment. One of the major ways that Gamergate enables harassment is through its anonymous swarm mentality. Gamergate at every turn claims decentralization. Like being attacked by a swarm of bees, rarely does any one person inflict a particularly grievous wound, each individual being able to dispute their own involvement or cite the timidity of their contribution. This allows for perpetual deflection of real harms because it is difficult to summarize the cumulative impact of hundreds of messages implying you are a liar or obnoxiously asking for proof of well-proven facts.
And thus, people push a reactionary ideology online because they can. And this is why we are seeing the rise of these right-wing movements in online spaces. I talk about it here, but it's very obvious to anyone who's spent any time in comment sections that anonymity breeds hate. Anyone who puts content onto the internet knows that, and that's where movements like Super Straight come in. Thank you. The rise of diversity and thought and content online has led to conservative backlash on sites like 4chan and 8kun, and in turn pushes narratives like Super Straight to weaken the ideological boundaries surrounding the actual movements and activism. In this case, specifically, the boundaries surrounding and within the LGBT community. TERFs, or trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or as the old joke goes, FARs, feminism appropriated, radical transphobes, have already gained a lot of screen time in modern media, and they don't need any more firepower, considering they've got one of the richest women in the world. And any perceived gain by trans people must be led by an equal and opposite force, lest the dirty queers push their agenda any further. The main problem, and I say this a lot in these videos, is that the reactionary movements are hard to stop at the best of times, but when they function as a decentralized online movement, they're near impossible to stop. You have to ignore the fire and hope that it gets bored and moves on, but there's a chance it could burn your house down. The push to take away rights from queer people of all colours and creeds is the same movement that attempted to keep black people segregated in the US 60 years ago, or in South Africa 30 years ago, or the movement that removed Indigenous children from their homes in Australia and Canada. Did that one ever really stop? It's just gotten worse. In 2016, America elected their most reactionary government ever. They didn't get much done, because for the most part, reaction as an ideology is a terrible way of getting things done. People don't usually want to go back to the way things were, because the way things were sucked. People just say that they were better because they're racist or sexist or transphobic or homophobic. It's a buzzword that people think sounds good, but really isn't. This lot were terribly unpopular and got voted out in 2020, and it remains to be seen as to whether reaction as an online ideology will continue to grow and spread. It probably will, but when it does, I hate to say it, but big tech firms will probably be the ones who have to take the lead and shut it down. The state has no power to do so, and I can hit report, comment, report, tweet only so many times before the constant "this comment doesn't breach our community guidelines" email breaks my spirit. Unless these tech firms suddenly empower the people to remove this kind of content by sheer force of will, which could easily lead to mass brigading and horrible things for the other side, and reactionary forces continue to invade our spaces, we have to hope that Jack at Twitter has a conscience and decides to start deleting Nazis, because we know Zuckerberg's not going to do it. What a depressing finish. I'd suggest creating some form of insular media space that can't be shut down, brigaded, invaded. But the more people you let in, the higher the chance that someone is going to jump in and steal that away from you. Two-factor authentication. Not just good for security on your phone, also a pretty good way of working out who's a Nazi.